we are not being asked, do you support euthanasia? Do you think euthanasia is a good thing? The question is, should the End of Life Choice Act come into force?
Welcome everybody to another episode of Gregorian Chat.
Today we're joined by an amazing lawmaker, but you're a man of the law, Sir Richard McLeod. The Sir part hasn't quite been added yet, but it will be.
I'm sure
once all this is done, I think.
So you know Dom and Dom. So Richard, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm this fine gentleman's brother-in-law, married to his eldest sister.
I was going to keep that secret till an opportune moment in the.
Very fortunate to be in the family, and we have two beautiful girls and another one coming very soon. And I'm a lawyer with about 25 years of experience in asylum law, human rights law and immigration law, so I guess I represent refugees and vulnerable people against the state, so that's kind of my bread and butter type of work.
Which of these wonderful books was your favourite book to read?
Oh, we tend to sort of kick these around the office these days. You get most of your law online, so this is really just window dressing, I'm afraid. So,
It looks good.
The oldest book there is about 1884. So this is the kind of the complete history of New Zealand case law and a lot of our statutes and laws that have been put in place in New Zealand since about the 1880s.
Oh, wow. So
So it's probably quite an appropriate place to have a discussion about a new law.
yes,
Very
and that's
true.
very much getting onto the topic. We're going to be talking about euthanasia because there's a bill that's being drawn up and trying to get through into Parliament. I don't know how it all works, but that's why we've got Richard here, and we're going to talk about that in this episode and hopefully help all us Kiwis come up with a good approach to this. Yeah.
I guess to get our facts straight from the beginning, so it's the End of Life Choices Bill is the name of the bill.
End of Life Choice Act.
Choice Act now, okay.
It is an act.
And so this is going to a referendum.
That's right. So this is called the End of Life Choice Act 2019. It was passed in November last year by Parliament, but it was passed with what's called a referendum clause in it, which means that the act will only come into force as an act 1 year after the majority of New Zealanders vote it into law through a referendum, which is to be held at next month's general election. So next month we're going to have obviously an election, and we're also going to have a referendum on cannabis and a referendum on this particular law.
So forgive my ignorance, but so when we go into the voting booth, will it be all in one form that we do this, or will it be
actually. I'm not sure how they're going to do it, though. I suppose they might have, one paper for who do you choose for your party vote and your electoral vote, and then possibly another paper on this and another paper on the cannabis bill. I'm not sure, but the question, this is the interesting thing, and I think this is what a lot of New Zealanders don't quite understand yet about this particular law, is that we are not being asked, do you support euthanasia? Do you think euthanasia is a good thing? The question is, should the End of Life Choice Act come into force? Basically, that's going to be the question.
Right.
And the answer will be that you tick will be yes or no. And so this is actually a referendum about whether a particular piece of legislation should become the law in New Zealand. It is not a referendum about what our views are on euthanasia. And in fact, you can be a person who's pro euthanasia, but you could still share the very strong concerns that we have about this particular law.
Which leads me to the first question, which is it only Christians who are interested in opposing this law, or who seem to be vocally against it?
No, in fact, what we're seeing at the moment are a number of Christians coming out in support of the law, from a Christian perspective.
Wow.
This is the unusual thing, and so it's been common for the proponents of this law to attack its opponents as coming from a religious point of view, when in fact now we're seeing proponents coming from a religious point of view as well. So it's messed up, to be honest. It's a real shame that it's become that, because it's become about sort of shoot the messenger, don't listen to the message. And I'm a part of a group of lawyers called Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders. So we are a group of 200 lawyers. We've been around for a couple of years. We comprise some of the best, myself excluded, some of the best and finest legal minds in the country. And I mean, there's about 10 QCs, Queen's Counsel. There's roughly 10 or 12 of our country's leading legal academics, and a number of very senior lawyers. And all of us have a variety of views on euthanasia. I know that some of us are in favour of euthanasia conceptually. That's not the point. I also know that some of us have religious views, and quite a few of us don't have religious views. I come from a religious viewpoint. Okay, I'm a Catholic. My co-spokesperson, Huhana Hiki, is an atheist. We don't poll our members on our religious views. We don't care what they are. We haven't made a single religious view on this particular piece of legislation. All we are concerned about as lawyers is this a clear and safe law for New Zealand? Is it going to be clear and safe, and are we going to be able to contain it? And the overwhelming unanimous viewpoint that we have in our group is that this law is too vague. It is not safe. It is not transparent. It is going to harm the weakest and most vulnerable members of our community. It is going to protect the people who abuse them. It is going to keep us all in the dark about who's being euthanised each year, why they're being euthanised, where they're being euthanised. We're going to get very, very little, if any, information about that. And at the end of the day, the passing of this law, if it passes, will not be the end of the conversation, as a lot of people think it will. It will just be the beginning.
And what have other countries shown, ones that have followed a similar trend? Has there been any euthanasia legislation that's pretty close to this act?
Yeah. So
what has happened? I guess, and you could say after that has been put into force.
This act follows very, very closely the Canadian legislation. So back in 2016, Canada passed what's called Medical Assistance in Dying Law, or MAID, and their MAID legislation is almost word for word the same as the End of Life Choice Act, with a few things that are slightly different. But same thing, we have instead of terminal illness, which is what this is limited to, they call it a reasonable foreseeability of death. Okay, which is almost terminal illness. You almost have to be terminally ill to reasonably foresee your death. But of course, interpretation of that is very loose. But they use a lot of the same terms as this one. You have to have unbearable suffering, whatever that might mean. So a lot of the same sort of terminology is used in Canada. Now we're already seeing, not only in the last 4 years have we seen very generous interpretations of that law in Canada, not only through the courts but also by doctors. But now, of course, within just 4 years, we're seeing that law being expanded. So it's no longer going to be just for terminal illness or people who have a reasonable foreseeability of death. They are expanding it now to people who are disabled, people who are chronically ill, so non-terminally ill people, and they are going to expand it to include what we call advanced directives are going to become lawful. An advanced directive is where a person has, for example, dementia, and at the time that they make the directive, they might be lucid and compos mentis, but they make a directive that if they reach a certain point where they can no longer recognise their family members or whatever, then at that point they would like to be euthanised. And that creates a whole lot of can of worms in itself, because how do you, for want of a better word, how do you end the life of a person who's got dementia on the basis of something that they signed 10 years ago.
Right.
And now they're sitting before you and they're very happy and docile and they'll do whatever you want them to do, but suddenly they resist any attempt to stick a lethal injection in their arm. Now that very thing happened in the Netherlands just 2 years ago, where a family member, a lady who had dementia, advanced stages of dementia, was held down by her family members while her doctor stuck a lethal injection of pentobarbital in her arm and killed her. And the doctor was ultimately prosecuted, and in the end they got off as well. They got off
the
that
fact
charge.
that she had wanted this at some stage.
Well, she
of
had,
her
yeah.
life, expressly.
Well, based on even in recent months and the months before her death, she had basically said, maybe euthanasia, but if I choose it. Well, she was making it very clear at the time of her death that she didn't want it.
Right.
But her family members decided to take things into their own hands, as did her doctor. So these are some of the problems that we can see with this type of a law. At the moment in New Zealand, we don't have a law that is going to have advance directives. But we will soon. And this is one of the points that I'd like to make, is that is this, people call it a slippery slope argument.
Right.
You know, if we enact it for terminal illness only, is it going to be far worse in a few years' time? And my short answer to that is absolutely it will. Absolutely it will. It is a logical and an empirical certainty, in my humble opinion, that if we enact a law like this just for terminal illness, within 5, 10, 15 years it will expand. And the reason for that, and in fact the interesting thing is, David Seymour says, no country that's ever enacted a euthanasia law has ever gone back. Well, there's one reason for that. There is no going back. Once you cross the Rubicon, okay, once you let a little virus like this into your system, okay, it invades the host. There is no going back. You will only see expansion. The only logical trajectory of a euthanasia law is to expand. It's what we've seen in the Netherlands and Belgium, not so much from a legislative expansion, but certainly from a practical and an interpretative expansion of the law that they had back in 2002. We've seen it in recent years, in particular in the Netherlands and Belgium, expanding into more and more dementia cases, advanced directives, more and more people being euthanised for mental illnesses, particularly in Belgium, where people are now being euthanised with increased frequency for things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, psychotic illnesses, and so on. And we've seen an expansion in Belgium legislatively in 2014, where they expanded it to children, any age, okay, no age limit. And since then we've had 3 children, I think aged 9, 11 and 17, who have been euthanised under that expansion. And in the Netherlands, shortly after the law was enacted in 2002, a new protocol was put in place to allow for the euthanasia of seriously disabled newborn infants, people with kids with spina bifida and so on. So clearly an expansion there, and a legislative expansion in some parts, but definitely a practical expansion.
And you know what I find scary is as you talk about that, euthanasia type legislation creeping from very much an elderly issue and coming closer and closer to the young. And then on the other end, we've just put through another piece of legislation which says that abortion, this new abortion law, coming from the other end. So in terms of thinking about
up until birth,
about the sacredness, or even simply the being able to care for life and how safe are we. You've got these 2 pieces of legislation
taken from both sides.
Both sides.
That's
really.
right.
It's like,
well, the interesting, the big debate, obviously, the big debate that's always raised in the abortion side of things is this a life?
Right.
Is this a human life? And we're not here to have a discussion about abortion, but clearly that there is a lot of debate around that issue. And the euthanasia argument, there is no question about that. We're not debating, are these people human beings?
No.
Yeah.
We are seriously now debating, for the first time in our history, whether our law whether our government
Yeah.
should be given the power, because that's really what this is about. The Ministry of Health will be overseeing this.
Yeah.
Whether our government and a few of our doctors should be given the power to end the lives of some people who request it. It's never happened before.
So
of course, we had capital punishment.
I was going to ask.
Yeah.
But we abolished capital punishment 33 or 4 decades ago.
Did that come after something in particular that forced us to say, okay, maybe we should abolish this?
It came after growing sort of international opinion against execution, because we could not, in the end, as a civilized society, we could not stand the idea that one innocent person might be wrongfully killed as a result of a law.
Right.
Yeah.
But
and
what
there's
are we
always
now
the
doing?
possibility of change, and that they may
That's right.
be innocent, or they may have been innocent all along.
That's right. And I mean, we still believe in that. As New Zealanders, we still believe, no, we shouldn't reintroduce the death penalty, because one innocent person is one innocent person who dies, that would be one too many.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that is really how we believe, if that is what we really believe as New Zealanders, then any act which proposes taking the lives of New Zealanders, even if they asked for it, would have to have the most anxious scrutiny to determine, could it happen that one innocent person might die as a result of this law? And that is really the question, is we have to ask ourselves, is there capacity for abuse in this law?
Yeah.
Have there been abuses in other jurisdictions that have had euthanasia laws? And the answer that we give you as lawyers is yes and yes.
Yeah, and this kind of brings me to the question about language and how it's being presented to us rather than what it's actually talking about. Because you often hear people talk about, like, do you think people should have the choice? Rather than say, yeah, but what is the choice to do? I heard someone once say, choice is a good thing, but there's some choices that are always wrong. There are always bad choices. And so could you talk to us a bit more about, like, the language that's being used and how it's being presented to how it actually is around choice? Sure.
Well, the explanatory note to the Act, because every Act that's enacted has an explanatory note where the drafters of the Act say this is what it's for, this is what it's designed for. So the explanatory note says that this is all about choice and compassion. It's about giving the choice to people, to a small group of people. This is the first thing. It's only for a small group of people who are in unbearable pain or unbearable suffering, they call it, and we'll come back to what that means soon, who are not vulnerable. It's very important we look at those words. So basically they're saying, if you're terminally ill and you want to have this choice and you can show us that you're not vulnerable, then this law is designed for you. So the very first question is, okay, how many terminally ill people are not vulnerable? I mean, that is the most vulnerable time of any person's life. When you get told you've got 6 weeks and 6 months to live, that is when you're the most vulnerable. That's when you really need care and support. So who could possibly convince a doctor or whatever that they're not vulnerable? Now, Lucretia Seals, she was able to convince the High Court in her case that she was not vulnerable. It's a Herculean task, I can tell you, because everybody is vulnerable in a situation like this. But we call ourselves lawyers for vulnerable New Zealanders because we know and recognise, and in fact we act for many vulnerable people. Okay, and what I can say is New Zealand has got so many different types of vulnerable people. For all sorts of reasons, but just looking at our elderly, the elderly themselves, anybody basically over the age of 75 is regarded by our Human Rights Commission as being vulnerable, particularly if they've got a carer or people who are looking after them. So people over the age of 75 are just by definition more vulnerable. People who have carers, people who are disabled and need caregivers are in a vulnerable situation. People with chronic illnesses, people with terminal illnesses, and a variety of disabilities. And amongst those people, Māori in particular are more vulnerable as a group than Pākehā. And we know this because it's been in our news media for many years that Māori are disproportionately represented in all of our vulnerability statistics. Okay, they are the highest in terms of their representation in our suicide statistics, our terminal illness, our chronic illness, our disability, prison. I mean, all of these sort of indicators of vulnerability are prevalent in Māori. So we have a claim at the moment before the Waitangi Tribunal by 200 Māori claimants that the healthcare system is sick and racist towards Māori. And they're going to win because it actually is. And they are actually disadvantaged when it comes to healthcare compared with Pākehā. Now, this brings us, so we've got all these vulnerable people in New Zealand. And not just Māori, let's talk about elder abuse. Okay, elder abuse, 1 in 10 New Zealanders at the moment are victims of elder abuse. Okay,
and so just to draw a quick connection, so that word vulnerability in essence is saying, these are people that could be likely to be abused, essentially, in some way, shape or form.
Yes. Okay. And these are people, so what I'm bringing now into the equation is who is at risk under this act? Under an act where a person can make a request to be euthanised, a person who is terminally ill, can make a request to be euthanised. Who are the people who are going to be possibly at risk of being coerced or being pressured or being made to feel that they have no other choice but to do this, you see? And it comes back to the very question of choice. And so look at elder abuse, for example. 1 in 10 New Zealanders who are over the age of 65 are victims of elder abuse. Okay, we have about 700 to 800,000 people in that category in New Zealand in the elderly category. So that's about 80,000 New Zealanders are victims of elder abuse. Half of the abuse is financial. 80% of the abuse is psychological abuse. 80% of the abusers are their family or whānau, and half of the abusers are their children. All right.
I've kind of experienced that. We used to look after a lady in our parish, and then she had a fall, and the family had to get involved, and they said they put her in a home, and they stopped her going to church, and they stopped anyone being able to see her. She's gone.
That's right. So I mean, elder abuse is probably one of your much more overt forms of coercion and pressure, right? But if you bring elder abuse into the euthanasia regime, my goodness. Like if there are people already, if there are children out there, half of the abusers of elder abuse each year, we're talking 40 to 50,000 people, are being abused financially. Okay, these are by children who want to get their hands on their money. Okay, now one of those victims then becomes terminally ill, and by becoming terminally ill, they become eligible to be euthanised if they ask for it under the End of Life Choice Act. And they are elderly, they are dependent on their kids, they are capable of being coerced or manipulated or pressured because they're already victims by being victimised by their children. And then their children realise, man, we can get away with this. And why can we get away with it? Because the End of Life Choice Act provides a legal shield, a defence for them that they can hide behind, because if you can show that you caused, facilitated or assisted in the euthanasia of someone, but you did it reasonably in good faith and reasonably believing that they wanted to die, then you have a defence, a criminal defence. Okay, but an elder abuser can just say, look, I was just helping Mum. I mean, she wanted to die. Okay, I gave her 20 brochures a day on euthanasia. I thought she should, know all about it. And okay, I encouraged her. I reminded her of her right to die, 50 times a day. But I was acting in good faith, and I reasonably believe it's just going to be so easy. And that's just one form of coercion.
And you talked about before those who are disadvantaged and vulnerable. Were they really the ones bringing this legislation to the table, or was it was it the rich? Or I'm interested in this. It seems that
no, it wasn't the vulnerable bringing it. Exactly, it's a very good point.
Who has brought this legislation to
Well, the
fruition?
legislation came on the back of the Lucretia Seales case. Now, Lucretia Seales was anything but vulnerable because she convinced the High Court in her affidavits, I'm not a vulnerable person. She said, I'm a lawyer, I'm, my husband's doing really well. They weren't vulnerable people at all. They were people who were very confident, very capable, very committed. They were, you could probably say they were in the more privileged class. She had the backing of New Zealand's biggest law firm, Russell McVeigh, and their $1 million pro bono budget to bring her case. Oh, wow. She convinced them, I'm not vulnerable. Okay, that's fine, she was able to convince them. But this act doesn't just apply to the Lucretia Seales of this world. Really? Although it's written for them, it applies to everybody. It applies also to the Huhana Hikis of this world. People, my co-spokesperson, who's Māori, who's disabled, who's got terminal MS, and she lives in South Auckland. And she doesn't have half the choices that someone like Lucretia Seales had. She doesn't have private medical insurance, she doesn't have a lot of money, she doesn't have a lot of power. And this is the problem with a law like this, is that it's been drafted, in my view, by the rich and the privileged. People who do actually have real choices. And this comes to the very heart of what this act is. What does choice mean? When I say to someone, it's your life, your choice, okay, well that assumes that all of us in New Zealand, we all have the same choices, and now what I'm doing, I'm just giving all of you just another choice. But that's not the playing field that we have in New Zealand. People don't have the same choices or as many choices as others. Okay, I'm a lawyer. I guess I could say, comparatively speaking, I'm wealthy. I'm up there with David Seymour and Matt Vickers and those guys. So if I get terminally ill, I can get private medical insurance. I can get Keytruda that will keep me alive for many years. I live in Central Auckland. I can access good palliative care. Okay, but if I live up in the upper north, far north of New Zealand, and I'm a sickness beneficiary, and I'm Māori, okay, and I get terminal cancer, I can't get Keytruda funding because Pharmax just denied that. Now they've said 1,800 people a year are not going to get it. I can't get palliative care because there's poor palliative care access to me. What really? I don't have private medical insurance. What are my choices? So how could we say to that person, it's your life, your choice? What the hell kind of choice do they have?
And I think a lot of young voters, like myself, not that young anymore, but will probably want to know, and they'll be thinking, I'm going to vote yes in this referendum to make this legislation, put into force, because I believe that everyone should have a choice.
Yes.
And even Christians, and I'm very interested to know what the Christian arguments were for euthanasia. But I'm interested to know what you would say to those who are thinking, what, I'm just going to vote yes in this referendum because I think it's not my issue and people should have a choice.
Okay, well, it's not your issue now, but I can guarantee it's going to become your issue one day because all of us are going to become vulnerable at some point in time in our life, especially if we become terminally ill. So what do I say? I would say, okay, I think there are a lot of people who are on the yes side at the moment who are very well-meaning. They think, I think that euthanasia is good. I think that people should have that choice. Okay, but have you considered the dangers of this act? Because the people who are going to be getting choice are not all on the same playing field. They're not all wealthy, privileged, elite people. There are people who have actually been denied a lot of different things. Okay, let's, for example, look at Canada. Okay, this is the first annual report. It's just come out of Canada this year. It's just come out a few weeks ago. Okay, this says last year about 5,500 Canadians chose euthanasia, right? And they've listed some of the reasons that they asked for it. What was their unbearable suffering? Okay, 13.7% of them, that's 770 people, said that the main reason, or one of the main reasons they wanted to be euthanized, was isolation or loneliness. That was their unbearable suffering. It wasn't physical pain. It was isolation and loneliness. Now in New Zealand, 1 in 5 elderly people live in extreme loneliness. 1 in 5. That's according to a University of Otago study. So what are we going to do? Are we seriously suggesting that we're going to help people to end their lives because they're lonely?
And that's not just an elderly issue either. Studies are showing that loneliness is affecting younger generations.
Oh yeah,
perhaps even more so than
and
yours.
interestingly, it's not even an economic issue as well. You could be wealthy and be lonely and isolated. It doesn't have to be. It's not necessarily a poverty-driven phenomenon. Here's another one. In Canada last year, 34%. And in Oregon, which has an assisted suicide regime, it's in the 50s every year. It's 50% or more of people who were euthanized said that it was because they were a burden on family, friends or caregivers. They didn't want to be a burden. Hang on a second. Are we seriously suggesting ending the lives of people who just don't want to be a bother? Is that what we're about?
Yeah, they're the people that are the most worthwhile to be around.
That's right.
They're such loving people.
Well, we have to really. That's the question we have to ask ourselves: is if our loved ones become sick and terminally ill, all right, of course they're going to feel that they're a burden. That's part of their vulnerability. Is, oh gosh, I just feel I'm a burden. And what is the correct response that we are supposed to give them as their children? Are we supposed to say, Dad, you're not a burden, it's a pleasure to care for you, I love you? Or should we say, yes, Dad, you are a burden, I'll just go and get the pentobarbital, because after all, it's your life, your choice. It's these are the discussions that we're going to be having. If this law passes, these are some of the very difficult situations that families are going to find themselves in very uncomfortable situations.
Is that not that I may be wrong here, but is that not things like loneliness a symptom of what you would say essentially mental illness? I mean, maybe I don't want to overstep my mark here, but not necessarily a symptom, but something that can often go hand in hand. I mean, you're saying
it can be a precursor. It can precursor to mental illness, to depression. If you're feeling lonely and isolated, because more and more New Zealanders are feeling that already, and it's often the case that people who are in that situation do develop depression.
And the Canadian law, was that passed with the same kind of constraints as ours, saying, well, you can only get it if you're vulnerable, or was theirs a little more...
Oh, you can only get it if you're not vulnerable.
If you're not vulnerable. Like, for instance, was the Canadian law saying, look, if you have some kind of mental illness or depression or something, you're eligible?
You have to pass a competency test, okay? So you have to be adjudged as being competent. And the supporters of this law and the Canadian law say, well, depressed people won't be competent. But that's actually not the case. Depressed people can be competent. Yeah. Competence means that you're capable of making a decision. That means you're capable of weighing the pros and the cons of a particular course of action and thinking about it and then making a decision and communicating that decision. That's competence. Okay, yeah. A depressed person can do that. Depressed people do that every day. They make decisions about their health care and so on. And in fact, when you look at the jurisdictions in Netherlands and Belgium, they're euthanizing depressed people every day. They're euthanizing depressed people just because they're depressed. Right. That's their unbearable suffering, and that's their condition. Now, this is what I say, is that is where we're heading. Now, why are we heading that way? Do New Zealanders, I know that they poo-poo the idea that, we're not going to go that bad. We can just contain this.
Yeah, well,
but we cannot contain this, and I'll tell you why. At the moment, it's just for terminal illness. We say, with this act, we're saying if you've got 6 months left to live and you're experiencing unbearable suffering, then you can be eligible. Okay. Well, we live in a country that abhors discrimination, right?
Right, yeah.
We don't want some people shouldn't have a right and other people be denied it. Well, this act is making euthanasia a legal right, a valid healthcare service that some people can enjoy and access. As soon as it passes, I guarantee you, there'll be another case, there'll be another Lucretia Seals, there'll be cases in our courts, and they will be arguing, as they did in Canada, why should that person have the right and not me? Why should we give terminally ill people with physical pain the right to die and deny it to non-terminally ill people with physical pain? And if we give it to them, why should we give it to people with physical pain and not to people with mental pain? Because after all, that's pain too, that's unbearable suffering. And if we give it to adults, why should we deny it to children?
Yeah.
And if we are going to give it to people for mental illness, then why don't we just give it to people who are over the age of 70 or 65 who are tired of living?
Yeah.
That's what's happened just 2 weeks ago in the Netherlands,
Right.
which has had this law now for 18 years. A parliamentarian has tabled a new bill saying that they should have euthanasia available to anybody over the age of 65 who's had enough of living. They should be eligible.
Yeah. So
That's the only criterion.
are you saying that, like, you know, because we went over those statistics, and I'm sure most people would say, yeah, but I wouldn't put forward that bill, and that's not what's in the bill right now. So, what would you say to people that say that? It's like, yeah, but that's not what we're arguing for this particular thing.
Well, what I say to you is, if you seriously believe that it's not going to expand, then you're actually deluded. I'm afraid that's wrong. That this is about, if you vote yes, then actually you have to understand that you are voting for a law that undoubtedly is going to expand because of your yes. We are crossing the Rubicon if we vote this law through. There is no going back. There is no going back. There is only one direction to go, because after the initial act of passing a euthanasia law has gone, there is only one debate after that. It's how to expand it, and whether to expand it, and who to expand it to. That's what we've seen in Canada, it's what we've seen in Netherlands, it's what we've seen in Belgium, and it's what we will see in New Zealand.
And this expansion, will it be put down to a referendum every time, or will it just be happening within the Parliament? Or
it will happen in Parliament in New Zealand, because unlike in Canada, you can go to court and you can actually challenge the law, and the courts can declare the law, declare that the Parliament has to change the law.
Wow.
Not so in New Zealand. In New Zealand, what they do is issue what's called a declaration of inconsistency, where they say that this act is inconsistent with the Bill of Rights Act, and it should be, whatever. And that can't force Parliament, but what it does do, it puts a lot of pressure on Parliament. And this is what we've seen already in this case. We've seen Lucretia Seals, that case, put a lot of pressure on Parliament through this act to change the law, to bring it just around for terminal illness. So what we'll see is future cases will bring pressure on Parliament to expand it to other cases, because why not? It's a logical certainty. There's no logical reason. Once we pass it, there's no logical reason for granting it to some and denying it to others. If it's all about unbearable suffering, then the sky's the limit. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Really.
And like you say, the vulnerable will experience suffering at a greater rate than those that are more privileged or more wealthy, because just living in an overcrowded house can be a bit of suffering.
And this is where, we've talked about expansion, and that's one concern, and that might be a concern that people might think, okay, well, that's enough for me to say I don't want to vote for this. But okay, if you don't want to accept that argument, what about abuse? And this is the other real problem, is that under these laws, the poor, the weak, the defenceless, they are the ones who actually face abuse. Okay, and let me show you a couple of things. This is Canada. Okay, in Canada, just in the last few years, here we go. This is the case of Roger Foley. Roger Foley was a chronically sick man in Canada, and his hospital staff basically took him aside and started to pressure him into requesting euthanasia because they didn't want to pay for his care, and he wanted home care, and they weren't prepared to give him that, but they started to say, hey, what about getting an assisted death? Okay, so he recorded those conversations. Here's the case. Candice Lewis, a chronically sick woman, mid-20s, with some spina bifida as well. And the doctors, they didn't pressure her, they actually took her mother aside and said, you should get euthanasia for your daughter. Wow. And when the mother refused, they said, you're just being selfish. That's Candice Lewis. Here's the case of Sean Taggart, okay, another chronically sick Canadian who couldn't get the care that he wanted. They weren't prepared to give it to him, the health system, but they were prepared to offer him euthanasia, and in the end he took it. Okay, here's a case where the Quebec College of Practitioners in May 2018 wrote to the health minister, said we have a serious problem in Quebec. We have a shortage of palliative care services, and it's pushing some Quebecers, well, actually hundreds and hundreds of Quebecers, to choosing euthanasia because they can't access palliative care. Yeah? So what are we actually seriously suggesting? That we can't care for you, but we can help you to kill yourselves? Right. Is that going to be our healthcare policy?
And so much it seems like it's tied to finances and what people can afford. And what really fascinates me is, this issue has been going on in New Zealand for quite some time, pre-COVID-19. And have you seen any kind of glaring inconsistencies in the kind of narratives being thrown around in government and in the media about the value of life through the perspective of what's happening with COVID-19, and then this piece of legislation? I mean, has there been any time where you've thought, wait a minute,
this is nuts.
That's not what you said last week?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know. I look at it probably a little bit differently. I think there's been a lot of inconsistency and contradictions in the way that we talk about the COVID problem and the way that we're talking about this issue, no doubt. But I think I'm looking more sort of into the distance, and I'm seeing that we are flying into a perfect storm. Okay, forget COVID. COVID's a major problem. I'm thinking about the economic impact of this COVID problem on our country. We are going to have this impact for generations, okay? That's the first problem. The second problem is that we don't have enough young people coming into our country. And we, in terms of being born, and we have a growing and ageing population. In the next 25, 30 years, we're going to have double the number of elderly people that we have at the moment. I'll be one of them. You guys maybe not just, but I'm almost there. Okay, we can't afford to keep everybody alive. And they're going to be living longer. We're going to be living sicker. And our health system is already groaning at the seams. At the moment, our every DHB is in the red. At the moment, our elderly over the age of 65 occupy 42% of our healthcare budget, $700 million a year. That's going to double in the next 20 to 30 years. We cannot afford to care for everybody. And guess what the answer is? Well, David Seymour's just presenting us with it. Okay, because in Canada 2 years ago, they commissioned a report. And the report was, what savings can the Canadian government have from a euthanasia regime? And they conservatively estimated, and this was based only on everybody who's sick, who's terminally ill, dying within a week of their natural death, okay? They conservatively estimated that they would save $130 million a year through euthanasia. Well, there you go, right there. There's 130 million reasons why Pharmac and its bean counters are going to love this law. Okay, because you can save a vast amount of money by helping and encouraging elderly New Zealanders, particularly elderly, to hurry up and die. That's what's going to happen. And I'm afraid that it's only going to be a matter of time before a future government or this government going to wake up to that very realisation that we've got to start encouraging and promoting this End of Life Choice Act, because how else are we going to care for everybody?
What one more major question I have in my mind is what are the kind of things that will tip a person when they're thinking about voting in this referendum tip them from voting yes to voting no, or vice versa? Or maybe if we just start from, if there are people now who are thinking of voting yes, what are the things that you would say that you think would tip them to voting no?
The very first thing is, I would say, if you believe that it's just for terminal illness, then I'm afraid you're deluded. It's not. It's not going to be for terminal illness. If you vote yes, you are actually voting to something that is going to rapidly, or maybe slowly, but absolutely is going to escalate into new and expanded areas that you will not be happy about. I can assure you. 10, 15, 20 years from now, New Zealand will look a very different place to what you had imagined it would be by voting for this law. You will have a law that will be available to probably mentally ill people. Okay, and if you want to have a country that starts euthanizing its mentally ill, like Belgium and the Netherlands is already, then vote for this act. But if you don't, then don't vote for it. So it will expand. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I would say, is you might be in favour of euthanasia conceptually. That's fine. That's entirely your choice. But if you are not satisfied that this law is safe and is going to protect vulnerable people from being abused, if you're not satisfied, then you can't vote for this law. You cannot, in good faith and good conscience, vote for this law. And I can assure you, as a lawyer and as a group of lawyers, this law does not do that. It does not adequately protect the weakest and most vulnerable members. There will be wrongful deaths. There will be people who die who should not have had to die. People who will be coerced and pressured into it. That is unacceptable. I don't want to live in a country where weak and vulnerable and defenceless people are ushered, manipulated, or coerced by abusive family members or abusive institutions into euthanasia. That's not the kind of country I want to live in. And I would urge you to look very, very anxiously and carefully at the so-called protections, which I submit completely fail people who are vulnerable. Completely fail. You know that the only way to detect whether a person is going to be pressured under this law is, the only requirement is that the doctor, the first doctor they meet, has to do their best to detect whether the person's been pressured. That's it. I'm not kidding, those are the words. It's like, just do your best, do your best, mate. Okay, so a doctor just has to do their best, and in doing their best, they can only speak to members of the person's family that they're authorised by the person to speak to, or to their doctor, if they have another doctor. But I mean, how many doctors know really what's going on in their patients' lives? So this is the problem, is that doctors can't do their best to detect coercion. In fact, the Royal College of GPs in New Zealand wrote to the Select Committee on this law and said, hey, we're not going to be able to detect whether people are being pressured.
Yeah, well, because also vulnerable
there's going to be wrongful deaths.
Don't have people to prefer to. That's why they're vulnerable.
That's right.
Plus, doctors, their job is to deal with sick people, right? So it's like, well, you must know him pretty well. What is he like when you see him? Well, he's always sick. Well, of course, that's why he's come to you, right?
Well, also, it's not doctor's job to determine whether the person's been pressured. And, I can tell you as a lawyer that in the law, it can take weeks and weeks of hearing before courts to determine that very question of whether a person is acting under duress or not, in contract law, commercial law, corporate law, whatever. So they're importing this entire burden, this very heavy burden, onto the shoulders of someone who's actually not even equipped to do it, who's not trained to do it, and doesn't have the resources available to them to do it. How do you determine whether someone's been acting under pressure, especially when you can't talk to their family? Like, oh, can I talk to anyone in your family? No. Oh, well, I guess I did my best. I mean, that is the level of protection that this law provides to the weakest and most vulnerable members in New Zealand.
And we have a huge problem with depression and teen suicide and depression. It just seems like a glaring oversight to think, well, you have almost a generation of young people thinking, man, life is very difficult. All I need to do is wait until I have X criteria, until I'm eligible for that legislation, and then suddenly...
And then there's amongst, again, the Maori and Pacific, depression is, anxiety is even more so. So then it's like, this kind of turns racial all of a sudden. It's like, we will be knocking off the non-Pākehā people in this country, and then along with them the poor Pākehā, and so it's like it's not even about choice anymore. It's like almost eugenic.
It's not choice. It'll be about compulsion. In the end, and eugenics. And people will say, oh, well, that can never happen in New Zealand. Well, really, it happened in the mid-90s. Selwyn Manning, the investigative journalist, uncovered a plot. I could call it that, a conspiracy within Jenny Shipley's Ministry of Health in the mid-90s to find ways to cut costs by denying certain categories of people who had end-life renal failure from getting treatment. And what they did was they drew up this list of people who they decided we won't give it to them. And it included people who were blind, people who were chronically ill, people who were disabled, people who had been in prison, people with an intellectual disability. It's a completely eugenically driven list of who who should we just refuse to give this to because it doesn't really matter?
Yeah.
That happened in our country, and do you think it can't happen again? Absolutely, it can happen again.
It's going to happen again and again.
And in fact, it will happen again, because I said we are flying into a perfect storm. We've got an economic crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen in generations. Yeah. We've got an ageing population. We've got more and more sick people. We've got Māori and others being denied proper health care. We've got the End of Life Choice bomb being thrown into the mix of it. It's I just think it's a recipe for disaster. So those are my two main reasons. Cool. What do you want to become as a country if you vote this through, and can we safely protect the weak and the vulnerable under this law? And my answer to that question is no, we can't. So really, it's just too dangerous.
Yeah, really, the title isn't End of Life Choice Bill. It's euthanasia. There's no two ways about it. It's like
the title
knocking off people.
The title is we should call it the End of Life for Vulnerable People Who Have No Choice Bill. Because that's, unfortunately, those are the people who are going to cop it. I don't deny there are going to be the Lucretia Seals and the Matt Vickers and the David Seymours of New Zealand who will probably get their choice, as they are in Canada. There are some wealthy people saying, this is great, yep, I'm going to, they're throwing euthanasia parties in Canada. Did you know that?
Oh my God.
Euthanasia parties, they get them all, everybody gets around, they sing a few songs, and then the doctor comes in and no, I'm serious, and everybody cheers. Big cheers! Yes. You have to see it to believe it. They actually are throwing them. So, anyway, that's that can. I'm sure that there will be people who will get their choice, but there will be a lot of people who won't, and who will still be euthanized.
Goodness.
Well, that's. I think that's about everything to talk about on the topic. Really, that seals it quite well.
I believe so.
Well, thanks for joining us, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
Opened my mind to things I didn't know, and
likewise.
Hopefully a lot of people will be influenced positively for this.
One more thing I guess I could say, is there anywhere that young people can go to for further information on this? What are the best sites? Because there's a lot out there which can be misleading.
Sure.
So where do you think the most
if you can wait a couple of weeks, we'll have an updated website for you at Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders, which is www.lvnz.org, and you'll find a lot of information there. But I would just first of all recommend that you read the Act. There are other websites such as Euthanasia Free NZ. They've got a good site. There's a couple of new campaigns I understand that are coming very soon too, that are going to have, I think the Defend NZ campaign has got some very good information on it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining us today and for your wonderful insights, and for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to once again address this issue.
My pleasure.
And thanks for tuning into this episode.
Stay tuned for more. God bless.